So now, I'm trying to be a little bit, I won't say controversial, but back in a few weeks ago, I came across an article, I think it was pretty much run through all the major chains, and it was about performance-enhancing drugs and kind of nefarious chemical laboratories in Russia. And to some extent it referred to, of course, the ban on Russian athletes following the 2014 Olympics, when they pretty much were caught, breaking, the KGB, FSB, or whatever. They were caught breaking into the drug laboratories and fudging the samples, and and it pretty much revealed a Russia-wide, program of fudging PEDs. And of course, everybody got caught. Even, Maria Sharapova got caught, and a whole bunch of Russian hockey performers or biathletes, whatever they were caught, from 2014 Olympics. Now, of course, the figure skaters were probably fudged. The results were fudged because the judges were paid off. It doesn't cost much apparently to buy a figure skating judge. Nonetheless, so I kind of began looking into the various information that was available on the internet, and then kind of going back in memory to what I remember hearing and reading, and et cetera, et cetera. So before the February Olympics started, I stumbled into an interview with a former Russian weightlifter. Well, he was Soviet weightlifter who participated in 1988 Olympics. And he was a medalist. I think he was a gold medal winner in his weight class as a weightlifter. And he said something pretty interesting. He said, well, of course they're all juiced. And then he added they weren't juiced voluntarily, but maybe many of them did not want to get juiced, did not want to take drugs, but they were told to take them by the people in the hierarchy. The Soviets came out, the Soviet administrators and the KGB officers that controlled the sport business or the sport came out to them and they said, well, if you want to go on a national competition, this is before the whole international, before the Olympics, before the World Championships, you got to take this, this, and that. I don't know if they were told exactly what they were taking. They pretty much assumed it was some sort of steroid performance or maybe human growth hormone or whatever. And then you sort of start to think about other teams. Now there was another player who was a former Soviet national team soccer player, defender, who became a fairly well-known pundit, who wrote a book about his experiences both as international and a national team player, a club player, going against his competition, where he said that there were a team or two or three or four that was given and actually had the whole laboratory working for them at the behest of the state. They did very well in international competition, and they were given a little bit of a stimulant so they could run faster and longer. And of course, he said that of course allowed them to do the same thing at a championship, to where if you want to play against them, those people were going to press you, all across the pitch, and they were going to do it for 90 minutes, unlike their competition in the West, where most people were drug tested or didn't have. Not that there's no one ever cheated in terms of taking drugs or taking stimulants. Anyway, so I kind of started to go back, and so when you look at the history of doping, or performance-enhancing drugs in sports, you can go back to pretty much the beginning of time, and people were always taking, they taking extra coffee or taking some relaxant or stimulants, whatever helped them to perform better in an individual field. Now, there are a number of instances well documented to where a bicycle racer, which is sort of a notoriously drug-dependent sport, where there's such a need for endurance over several hours of biking, that one needs to have energy to do it over over the time frame. It's not just sprinting; it's really the endurance, and so of course that led to all that sort of blood doping, etc., etc. So that was something that kept through the ages in the Olympics, and then in sort of Tour de France, where we all remember that Armstrong took a whole bunch of, whatever. The thing was steroids, and then, Lance Armstrong. And then there were other performers who were pretty much caught at some point in time. And, so that is, not in question anymore. We all know that at least performers in one sport have constantly been taking drugs. So you start reading on the history of drugs. Like, they used like cocaine-based drugs, like Coca-Cola, which had elements of trace. So you hopped up on whatever stimulant you go, so you can drive for 3 hours. And if you hopped up too much, your heart gave out and you died. That wasn't good. You didn't win a gold medal if you died before crossing the finish line. So that was kind of like early part of the 20th century. Now the big jump happened in the middle of 1930s when the Germans, at the time they were under the Nazi regime, but they probably worked on it from before, essentially invented first methamphetamines. Now it became the drug they produced, the chemists have produced, became legendary Pervitin, probably in English pronounced Pervitin, in German it was Pervitin, in Russian it was Pervitin. So Pervitin was an methamphetamine, that the German military used to give to its soldiers. Next day you're going, you have to march 30 miles, take this pill, and let's go. And so, before, the big marches, certainly before the military conduct, the German soldiers were given Pervitin. Pilots of airplanes who were needed to fly over long distances were given Pervitin. Night watchmen, because they didn't want night watchmen to fall asleep, they were given Pervitin. Hitler, and you might have heard of Hitler. Well, Hitler, of course, had personal physicians, and the guy's name was Dr. Theodor Morel, or Theodore Morel, as you will say it in English. So Dr. Morel administered Pervitin by injections. It was very powerful. It allowed Hitler to be very happy for a long time. Of course, there were moments when he went completely insane, whether it was due to his unstable personality or some sort of mania, which is probably all of the above, or Pervitin. It was a combination of all of them. And once again, Dr. Morel kept records of what Hitler wanted, and that was one of many drugs he kept giving him. So, but at some point, Hitler's head was pretty much messed up for many reasons besides sort of his native pathology or criminality. But the Germans have produced methamphetamine, the Pervitin, in such great numbers that it was pretty much, in fact, I was very accidentally, I stumbled into the relics digger, somebody who would, dig during the combat territory in Europe, and they would, they embark on various digs trying to, sort of archaeological, but sort of military history based. And he found a little box that was labeled Pervitin. So in other words, a soldier, an officer, who knows, whether it was, killed in action or right, had this box, and he was, the Pervitin was dispensed in these boxes. The tankers call it Panzerchokolade, or the chocolate for tank crews, because you don't want to fall asleep in during the battle. You want to have energy. Well, here's the pill. Go fight for the Fuhrer. And that's what went on during World War II. Now, Americans and the British, they didn't have methamphetamines. They had amphetamines, which they also dispensed in large quantities. They gave it the same way to pilots, to sailors, to submarine guys, to night watchmen. That was quite popular. American drug wasn't quite as strong as the British drug compared to Pervitin, but nonetheless, it was the same vein. Amphetamines, an upper, a diet pill. Oh, you don't need to eat. You can, pretty much hop around and jump around all day and be okay. And Americans proceeded with various types of pills, through Vietnam War, etc., etc. So, but pervitin was the first major drug, in my opinion, that could have been used for enhanced performance for the athletes. Simultaneously with pervitin, almost at the same time, the German chemists were quite prolific, obviously. They produced the synthesized male steroids. And the first male steroids was synthesized or produced or sort of gobbled up together from bovine sperm. And that was in the 30s, and that was just produced in very limited quantities. But as the development into steroids kept on, by war's end, steroids were synthesized, I believe, in Mexico, from a certain type of, it was like a potato root, but it was synthesized from a vegetable, or not a fruit, some sort of a root. So in other words, they were able to synthesize steroids and make it fairly affordable. In other words, you don't need to well, we're not going to do any gestures how they got the bovine sperm, but in other words, the steroids became affordable, and the first bodybuilders, or the first people who were sort of into weightlifting, began to take steroids, because it was fairly weak at the time, by the late 40s. By 1952, American weightlifters indicated that they were fully aware of the Soviet weightlifters taking steroids and crushing their competition. And so this is the era where the steroids and pervitin come together. In other words, you have players with bigger mass, bigger, stronger, faster, who cannot run longer, faster, better. And so you have this kind of a chemically induced, chemically created athlete by the early 50s. Now, the Soviets, for example, have long had these special laboratories where they would test drugs on mostly prisoners, of course, their own, and see how they react. And so somebody, when I was watching this kind of a video from Russia, where they had the Soviets got pervitin from the Germans before the war when they were friendly, and of course they got the labs and the doctors after the war, so the pervitin production went to full hilt, even though it wasn't necessarily that secretive. Once you figure out how to make it, you got the formula, you got the process, you can just manufacture it. So the first sign of performance-enhancing drugs playing a significant part in global soccer, in my opinion, and this is unproven, so I'll let you know. It's a TV working. The first major factor, the first major event, was the Hungarian soccer team of the early 50s to mid-50s. Now, the Hungarian soccer team at that time, and to this day, according to statistical records, is the greatest soccer team of all time. Hungarians, with many players that would go down in history as one of the greatest, Ferenc Puskás, Nandor Hidaguti, Sandor Kosic, dominated the global soccer scene in the 1950s. The famous, or for the English, infamous meeting were the home and away, home would be London's Wembley Stadium, and away at Budapest, was meeting between the England, which at the time was considered one of the strongest team in the world, and the Hungarian team, who got significant notoriety, significant fame, to play the English as the meeting of the two of the Titans. While the meeting of the Titans didn't go as planned, Hungarians beat the English team at the time with great players like Stanley Matthews and others. They beat them in Wembley by 7-3 score. I think it was 7-3, 6-3, 7-3. Anyway, it was a demolition. And there was one goal that didn't count. And Hungarians looked phenomenal. I mean, not only did they move well, they outran the English team in every way. So the English, of course, thought that while we figure out their tactics, we go to Budapest and a away match, we're going to show that it was just one-off. They went to Budapest, they lost 7-1. It was a disaster. In other words, the English team could not perform on that level because the English probably didn't have a drug laboratory working at their level. Now, why do you think it's likely, it's very likely, that Hungarians were completely doped? Well, if you look at Hungary now, to where now it's part of the Western culture, its players are tested as part of the UEFA, and they're tested by the UEFA medical staff when they go play locally, internationally. The Hungarian national team is ranked somewhere around 60th. And if you look, well, what about these great Hungarian players? And you can't find great Hungarian players. I mean, their best players, sort of the also-rans, in Germany, and some players played in England, but they just don't have a great roster. They don't have great stars. And so you ask why? What could happen? I mean, Hungary is, it's essentially a population of the same size, and when the Soviet Union collapsed along with the entire European bloc countries, Hungary still kept its population. I mean, Czechoslovakia split in two. The Soviet Union broke up into, 15 parts, with the Baltics and so on and so forth. But Hungary remained Hungary. But Hungary can play soccer in, second decade of the 21st century is the way it played in the 1950s. So why? Well, to me, the likeliest scenario is that, of course, the players in the 1950s were using all the benefits of the state-sponsored medicine. And maybe the players didn't exactly know what they were taking. Nonetheless, they took the right drugs. They were bigger, faster, and stronger than everybody. So the global soccer now, forget about Brazil and Germany. Well, Germany beat them in '54. But Hungary was the dominating power. And if you go look at the records, then there's a site called ELO Ratings, ELO, name of the Arpad Ela, who is ironically Hungarian. If you look at the record of matches that Hungary played, they were crushing everybody, and they were just simply not losing. They didn't lose for like 3 years or 4 years. They were just simply the best team of all time. Their rating by ELO was 2,200 points, their top, or somewhere around 2,200 points, which is much higher than Brazil or Germany has ever gotten. Brazil, the country of about 200 million people, Germany, the country of about 80 million people, well, West Germany was 60 or so, 65. So this little tiny Hungary all of a sudden outperformed all the bigger nations over the long period of time. The sole explanation I have is they knew they were good players who had great coaches who used great doctors. It was a combination of all three. Now, Hungary was the German ally in World War II, so they probably had Pervitin, leftover Pervitin from World War II. The Russians, or the Soviets, began to manufacture Pervitin in the Soviet Union following World War II, and it was actually produced legally and sold in drugstores until mid-70s. According to the Soviet Russian language Wikipedia, it was sold until 1975. I mean, you could walk into a pharmacy, apteka, whatever they're called, and buy Pervitin, just either with, I don't know, you required a prescription, I should say, subscription, I would say, just like magazine, delivered to you nightly and daily. So that was fully legal. Now, let's go further from the Hungarian team to the East German swimmers of the 70s and the 80s. We know that, and how we know it? Well, we know that the athletes, the East German athletes, were heavily under performance-enhancing drugs. We know it from the documents because when East Germany collapsed, and it became Germany, well, it didn't collapse, they just kind of said, okay, fine, we're joining in. But the records were taken. The records of East German secret police called Stasi, and the records and all the diaries and all the notes from the East German athletes. So the fact that they were heavily on performance-enhancing drugs, including steroids, was very much understood in the West. There's no way the athletes from tiny East Germany, 15 million people or so, or 12 million people, could dominate the international sports scene without some sort of drugs, and there's no way they're swimmers who developed such gigantic muscles because they were female swimmers and they had bigger muscles than men. I mean, pretty much literally than male swimmers. Well, here's the kicker. The East German swimmers never got caught. They knew how to cheat on tests, which was, of course, the core of the whole program. They knew how to go to a competition and beat the test. Though it was all found out, but it took, at least from the 70s when they began to take, to experiment with PEDs, to the 1990s or so when East Germany collapsed and their records were taken over by West Germany and became Germany. But the program was just huge. It was done, quote unquote, scientifically by doctors and administrators, and it was all controlled by German version of KGB. But it never failed drugs. Now, why did it never fail drug tests? Well, for a long time, the test on steroids was a urine test, and you test on the ratio of a male hormone, which is testosterone, and a female hormone, which is progesterone. As long as the ratio was within 5:1, you pass the test. Well, what happens if your ratio was 40:1? You would fail the test. So what would people do? Well, take a shot, under controlled condition, take a shot of progesterone. So they could probably have a 1:1 ratio. As long as you inject the right amount, this is for males, but as long as you inject the right amount of progesterone, you look like a little lady. And so the Russians and the East Germans and probably the Hungarians and the Czechs never failed those drug tests. They always performed. Now, in fairness, the first steroid tests were fully developed by the mid-'80s. They were there in '84, but they really were kind of weren't set up properly. So they were administered professionally in 1988, which was the Seoul Olympics, which is where Ben Johnson got caught, and of course the famous sprinter. Some of you may remember. A Jamaican-born, Canadian-raised, ran for Canada, established world records, beat Carl Lewis, and then people realized he was doping. Well, he got caught. Of course, I'm sure there were others who didn't get caught. Ben Johnson got caught. The Soviets essentially never got caught. Now, there were some skiers, I remember, who got caught for ephedrine, which is, an amphetamine that you take for when you have a cold. And so she just had a cold, she took it, but she probably just didn't, ingest the right amount, or they weren't able to mask it. Well, to me, it's quite obvious that the great success of the Soviet-era East European communist nations, in other words, the success between 1945, or when the Olympics started again, 52 through 1990, was based on performance-enhancing drugs. Now, as a part of the Soviet Union, you can look at other nations. For example, let's take Georgia. Georgia is a small 4 million plus people country, so around the Middle East, north of the Middle East, and Caucasus Mountains. In 1982, Soviet Union was ranked either number 1 or number 2 by ELO, and this is kind of retroactive because it wasn't official then. But they were one of the top teams in the world, and in fact, when they went to the World Cup and played Brazil in their opener, they should have won. The judge missed 2 or 3 clear penalties, including a clear handball or some, a penalty that may have been given for a trip. And then the Soviets essentially were leading Brazil, which was probably one of the greatest Brazil teams ever. In 1982, they were in the same group. If you look at the Soviet roster, it had something like 4 Georgian players. They didn't all play in the same game. And the best Georgian player of all, a guy named David Kipiani, was injured, so he would have been probably the starter. He was a great player. He was an MVP in the Soviet League in the late 70s, things like 77. He really was a top-notch player. So you can take the best Soviet team of the time, and essentially you can put most of its field players. You can select, a half from Georgia. You had Ramaz Shengelia, you had Vitalis Daraselia, you had Sukhviladze, some other guys. I can't remember all the names. But there was like between 4 and 7 players that were serious candidates for the 82 team, and there were 7 players in total that were capped by the Soviet team, the Soviet national team, in 4 or 5 years preceding the 82 World Cup. Surab Selankvelidze was one of the players. Anyway, I looked it up on Wikipedia. Anyway, so now where is Georgia now? I think Georgia now somewhere around 90th. Now at the time, when the Soviet Union was in top 2, you could essentially take half of the team from Georgia. They were playing for Dynamo Tbilisi at the time, or Dynamo. And you can take, some backup. You can take the first roster and some players from other team or two, like Torpedo Kutaisi. Some of the, promising talents were sort of farmed out to Kutaisi. But if the Russian team, the Soviet team of 82, was among 2 or 3 best, it's quite likely then you could have fielded a Georgian team from that era. If there was allowed, because there was and it was part of the Soviet Union. Now it's a separate country. But if you fielded a Georgian team from that era, it would be in the top 10, maybe top 15. Now, Dynamo Tbilisi did play in various international competitions, just like a representative of the Soviet Premier League or Elite League, or whatever it was called. And they won the Cup Winners' Cup in 1981 with Kipiani, with Daraselia, with Shengelia, with Gogia. Or is it Gabelia? He was the goalkeeper. There was Machaidze. In other words, it was a very good team. Now, they ended up losing, and there's a highlights on YouTube, of course. They lost to Hamburg at the time. They lost them like 4-1 in Hamburg because they couldn't compete against Horst Frubisch. When you're like 6'3" and you can outmuscle for high balls, then no amount of performance-enhancing drugs probably could immediately compete you. But so the height of their probably greatest performance was defeating West Ham in London, like 3-1 or 4-1, and this is their sort of a achievement of all time, when Dynamo Tbilisi defeated Liverpool 3-0. Now that was a Liverpool team that was continuously winning either the English titles or the European Cups winner. Because it was their era with John Toshak and Kenny Dalglish, and then Kevin Keegan left and came and went. That was a great Liverpool team that won like 3 or 4 European Champions Cup, the precursor to the Champions League at the time. And they beat them in Tbilisi 3-0. They outran them in the second half. The first half was 0-0. Then Liverpool just couldn't run with Tbilisi. Now, forget about Dynamo Tbilisi. Of course, they can't compete for financial reasons anymore. It's just a small country, small market, relatively no money. But you can take the national Georgian team, it will get destroyed. Forget about Liverpool. It will get destroyed by average champion, English English Premier League club. In other words, and so you ask the same questions with regards to Hungarians. What happened to the Georgian national team? What happened to the talent? Well, they have some talent. They had Shorar Viladze, they have Kihadze, the guy at Milan. But for the most part, they cannot put together, starting 11, or and you need 13 to 15 players with injuries, suspensions, and the like, in order to compete consistently on the international scene. So Hungary cannot do it. Georgia cannot do it. Belarus was never a huge power, but in 1983, Dynamo Minsk won the Soviet championship. So it was competed against Dynamo Kiev, which presented or stacked most of the Soviet national team of the era. Although 83 probably wasn't the year, but it was in 86. So Dynamo Kiev, and this is, you have to sort of transfer, but Dynamo Kiev was essentially the Soviet national team, or could function as a Soviet national team. So he had great players. Dynamo Minsk outperformed them to win the championship. So you figure, well, Dynamo Minsk, which mostly stuck to players born in Belarus or Belarus at the time, would have incredible amount of talent. Where's Belarus now? That was from like in the 70s and 80s. So at the time, they were competing against the team that was essentially ranked in the top 5 in the world. And now they cannot be in the top 80s. Why? Well, I think the most obvious example is that, athletically they can't compete. At the time they could, because everything was done internally. They had, the entire system in place for athletes to perform at the very top level at any cost. And now they can't. And the sole difference, now there are many differences, of course, there's financial, so on and so forth, but, that's one thing that clubs, the East European clubs can do as well as they did. I mean, Steaua, Bucharest won, and then the Crvena Zvezda of Yugoslavia won the Champions League. And at the time they competed very well. They can't compete anymore because they can't get the best drugs. Right?